before I get started, let me get you guys restarted and energized. So here's what I'm gonna ask you to do. I want you to stand up, and I'm gonna give you 15 seconds to high five as many people as you can find in here. Starting, get up on your feet. This is not a couch, it's starting now. Go, you got 15 seconds. 15 seconds, 10 seconds. I want to see who gets the most. I see some turbo high-fiving going on there. 5 seconds, 3, 2, 1, and time. All right, I hope you guys are re-energized. Grab your seats or continue to high-five the serving staff here. Awesome. I hope you're re-energized a little bit because I'm going to try to energize you with a few things about risk-taking, because risk-taking should be energizing. That was a little bit of a risk to get up and high-five people, but once you got your momentum, you were doing it. Ladies and gentlemen, innovation is hard. Innovation is hard because it's uncertain. And where there's uncertainty, there's risk. There's lots of risks that we face. Launching a new product, new offerings, starting a new business, going out onto the soccer pitch, the football field, the wrestling mat alone. We're not certain what's going to happen. But innovation cannot happen. It is impossible if we don't take risk. It is absolutely, categorically going to be business as usual. The same incremental stuff unless we become thoughtful risk takers. Now, when I think about the big risk takers and the real innovators out there, lots of people cross my mind. Steve Jobs from Apple, Bill Gates and Microsoft, the Wright brothers, first in flight. But there's one guy who immediately, to me, is the supreme risk taker who innovates different than any person that I've ever seen before. It's this man, Philippe Petit, man on wire. If you're familiar with Philippe Petit, he is the greatest performance artist, perhaps, who's ever lived. If you don't know who he is, this man has traversed across a tiny wire between the Twin Towers, over thousands of feet high, the Grand Canyon, Niagara Falls. This guy is the biggest risk taker I've ever come across. But for me, it's not about what he does, it's about how he does it. It's how he does it. He is the grand master of experimentation, and we can learn a tremendous amount. I'm going to tell you more about him, but if you don't know who he is, this video, which I'm going to roll back from probably about 40 plus years ago, will give you a little sense of what Philippe Petit has done.
It started out as another routine morning for a New York helicopter traffic reporter, but he had more to tell his radio listeners than how the traffic was on the West Side Highway.
Well, I'll tell you what, I have a very queasy feeling in my stomach right now because I'm at, 1,500 feet. And up here at 1,500 feet, or in that area, there is somebody out there in a tightrope walk between the two towers of the World Trade Center, right at the tippy top.
That somebody was Philippe Petit, a 24-year-old Frenchman, doing his higher wire act 1,350 feet up and no net below. He and some associates managed to hide out in the World Trade Center towers overnight, and early this morning rigged a 140-foot steel cable between the two buildings using some sort of crossbow device. Petit enthralled hundreds of people below, prancing about for more than an hour. But police in the audience decided Petit was better off in a police station, handcuffed securely to a chair.
Why did you do this? That's the thousand why in this morning. There is no why. Just because when I see a beautiful place to put my wire, I cannot resist.
Sergeant Charles Daniels, who talked Petit off the high wire, called it a first-rate performance.
He was bouncing up and down. His feet were actually leaving the wire, and then he would resettle back on the wire again. And then he would go down on one knee, and he'd balance his hand pole and lay down on his back and put his hands behind his neck and just completely relax and swing one of his legs over the wire in a carefree manner.
Was he laughing and smiling?
Well, not when he would do that. He would just lay there and relax as if he wanted to just take a little nap.
As spectacular sights go, how would you rate this one?
Supreme. The apex of excitement.
Petit was charged with disorderly conduct and criminal trespass and received a quick sentence, doing a free show for children in Central Park. Chris Kelly, CBS News, New York.
Just thinking about being that high up and laying down a wire just makes my stomach turn. I feel absolutely queasy, and I've seen this multiple times. What really strikes me about Philippe Petit is this, though. When he was asked, "Are you a risk taker?" he said, "I'm not a risk taker. My preparation is so thorough that nothing is left to chance. I am not a risk taker. There's nothing left to chance." If you think about this, he's a man who's performed in front of many crowds. No net, no harness. He was being followed by the police crossing Notre Dame in Paris, walking across a high wire. And then, of course, perhaps one of his greater feats was Niagara Falls, with the winds buffeting him as he went again without harness or without net across it. But he is not a risk taker. And here's why. He doesn't see any risk because he is experimenting every day, testing every single assumption, evaluating every single uncertainty as he simulates this in his backyard. In his backyard, he has a 50-foot simulator, a huge sort of wiring setup contraption with a team where he'll start at 2 feet off the ground, then go to 4 feet, then 8, then 16, then higher and higher. And they start to introduce all different elements into it. Wind conditions, other factors to try to predict what might happen. By the time he would go to Notre Dame, or the time he would go to the World Trade Center, he has run many thousands of little mini experiments and tested to the point where there is no risk, or there is no perceived risk. He swiped multiple documents everywhere he goes to research and understand the factors and the circumstances that he'd be facing. And then he would create diagrams. As it's been said about him, he had diagrams for his diagrams and blueprints for his blueprints. This is a man that will leave no stone unturned. He's looking to find every possible mistake and assumption, testing, learning, and if it doesn't work when he tested, adapting. So in the words of Niels Bohr, or an adaptation of it, is an innovator learns all the mistakes that can be made in a very narrow field. Innovators learn all the mistakes that you can be making. That's what Petit did, learning the mistakes and then applying them so they can advance through a masterful form of experimentation. Now, you may be thinking, what does this have to do with me? I'm not planning to go on a high wire. Well, I see this as being very relevant to what we do, whether you're developing new products, whether you're developing new offerings. It's about looking for all the mistakes that could happen, finding all the hidden assumptions, the killer assumptions, and then testing them so that it feels like there's no risk at all. So to bring this to life, what I'd like to do is have us play a game together. Now, Frost & Sullivan, unbeknownst to you, has set up a high wire right back there. So, okay, there is not a high wire back there. I don't believe they've got the liability insurance for it. But a good second solution is for us to play a game. And to do that, I'm going to give each of you $10,000 to invest. You feeling good about that? You're $10,000 richer. Maybe you're $10,000 richer. Because here's the conditions of this. I'm going to introduce two companies to you, two real companies. And you're going to have to make a choice, company A or company B to invest in. You want to find out who you're investing in? Yeah, why not, right? Let's find out who's going to make you wealthy. But before I do that, let me also just let you know that we're going to wind the clock back again. This time it's to 1999. You remember 1999? We're so much younger in 1999. It's been 20 years. If you remember 1999, some of these things will kind of stand out for you. We didn't get our directions from Waze or from a GPS. We got it from printing MapQuest. Remember that? We had no Wi-Fi. We had AOL. I think that still exists. At least someone confirmed that for me today. You remember that sound you got from AOL when you logged in? That right? The sound you get, that's how we got on. It was slow, but it worked. We didn't stream videos from Netflix. We went to Blockbuster, and we stood in line, and we paid those outrageous late fees. If you remember those, I remember those. And we didn't have iPods, we didn't have iPhones, but we did have the Sony Discman. This was definitely a different time with respect to digital. And since we're going back to 1999, it's only fitting that we look at two companies competing in the burgeoning online space. Now, I'm not going to tell you what industry it's in yet. You're going to have to guess what that is. But I'm going to have you invest in two different companies, but picking one in the burgeoning online space. So, Company A. Let me tell you a few things about Company A. It's being led by a young tech entrepreneurial company. Their leader has been very successful in exiting a couple of different businesses and doing incredibly well. He's a bit of a serial entrepreneur. They're private equity backed. In fact, they have over $100 million that's invested in from Silicon Valley. And they have the best and brightest working on this business right now. They also, to their detriment, have limited experience in this category, but don't worry, they have a ton of experience in online because, again, as I said, their entrepreneur, their leader, has been successful at entry and exit online digital markets. Company B. Well, Company B is a little different. They're a large traditional company. They don't have huge pockets. They're not getting private equity funding, but they do have working capital that they're going to use to fund their investment in this business. They have a long-standing CEO, not somebody who's a serial entrepreneur. And last but not least, they have an understanding of the market. However, they really have very limited experience in online and digital. This is something new. They only have a couple people across the organization that have been playing with this. So those are the facts. That's the information you now need to invest. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask you to make a choice. If you want to invest in Company A, I'm going to ask you to stand up right now. Stand up if you want to put your money in Company A. Ready? Company A investors. All right, we got some brave souls. We got the herd effect coming into play. All right, we've got about a quarter, maybe half of the room. Stay standing up. Don't sit yet. If you want Company B, your turn. Stand up for Company B. And just to let you know, there is no Company C. You cannot run away with this money. You cannot put it in a Swiss bank account. You could try. It'll be hard to cash that check. Would you like to know who you just invested in? Well, if you invested in Company A, you just invested in a company called Webvan. If you don't know Webvan, I'll tell you all about them in a moment. If you invested in Company B, you invested in the British supermarket Tesco. Congratulations. If you want to know exactly how you did, let me tell you. Webvan, wah, wah. You lost your entire $10,000, I'm sorry to say. But don't worry, don't feel bad. They lost almost $1 billion collectively in 2 years. It's not so bad. If you invested in Tesco, on the other hand, you've made over $2 billion, $100 million profit, and you are, as of 2002, you're the largest online grocery retailer, because we are in the online grocery business. So congratulations if you bet on Company B. You're a lot wealthier than your neighbors to the side of you. So grab a seat. What happened here? What happened? Webvan. Now, a lot of people don't remember Webvan. I do. A guy named Lewis Borders from Borders Books. You might remember Borders Books. Now, Lewis Borders was really successful in taking the brick and mortar book business and taking it online. He was incredibly successful. And he figured, you know, I can do that with groceries because people should be buying for convenience store groceries online. There's a little bit of a miscalculation, though, there. A book may be a book, but an apple is not always an apple. So he had a very infamous interview with the Wall Street Journal. Let me just share a couple of words from this. When the Wall Street Journal interviewed him, they had said, if it thrives, and even if it doesn't, Webvan we're talking about, Mr. Borders plans to open another enormous grocery warehouse in Atlanta a few months later. And down the road, there are plans for at least 20 more such warehouses or facilities. Wherever there's a major sports team, that's where we're going to build it. They build dozens of warehouses but they weren't even sure if it was going to work. Mr. Borders built dozens of these with the almost $1 billion of capital that had been built up in this business. You see, Webvan is a great example of what I would call kind of the house of cards. We're not talking about Kevin Spacey here. We're talking about house of cards when it comes to assumptions and testing and learning. You see, at the base or the foundation of this are what I call killer assumptions. These are the things that hold up your house of cards. But if just one of those cards falls, the whole deck comes down. The house collapses under its own weight. So we need to find these killer assumptions. In the case of Webvan and Tesco, well, there were a couple of big ones. One of the biggest was around consumer behavior and converting from being an in-store shopper to being an online shopper. You know, if you think about it, in 1999, how willing were you to put your credit card on the internet, on the World Wide Web, which we didn't know exactly where it was going, were there cyber criminals? My mom's still afraid to put her credit card online. She thinks there's Russian moles waiting there to steal her credit card. In 1999, people were generally concerned and worried about putting their data out there. Furthermore, as I mentioned before, an apple's not always an apple. You go to a supermarket, you want to check the expiry on the milk yourself. You want to check the melons and thump your own melons to make sure that those melons are fresh. You know, it's a very high involvement, high touch experience. The other thing that really had killed Webvan, as we just alluded to, was around warehousing, the experience of operations. Now, bagging delivery is pretty straightforward when you think about it, but we do all the work. You know, in this industry, supermarkets, anyone who's ever worked personally in this industry, it's about 1% to 2% margins, really razor thin. So given how thin those margins are, now you're going to own all of the operations. Today, what do? You go to the supermarket, you go into the store, you pick out all of your goods and items and put them in your cart. You take your cart out to the checkout, you check out, you bag it, you bring it into your car, you go home, you put it away. Almost all of that is now going to be owned by Tesco or Webvan as they do this. And if there's a major miscalculation, they're not making 1% to 2% margin. It's going to be a whole lot thinner. So this was a killer assumption. This is one of the major things that killed Webvan. What it comes down to is something that I refer to as the knower's mindset. You know, when you think about it, Borders was very successful. He understood the online market, but maybe just a little too well. His expert intuition, his knowledge is perhaps what held him back. Those patterns of thinking were so locked in. We're so locked into our expertise that we believe the past will always predict the future. So that was a great idea to model on the Borders books, but it had to be changed. The assumptions were different. This is the danger of the knower's mindset. Now, if we juxtapose that with Tesco, what did Tesco do differently? Quite a lot. But if you look at this quote from David Tang, who was the deputy chairman at the time, specifically said, "We started off with just a few stores. We focused on perfecting the system. All of their work at Tesco was around testing and learning." You see, they took the test, learn, adapt route because they had to. They were burning their working capital. They didn't have hundreds of millions of dollars of private equity funding running through the business. So you think about it, they started with the most killer or basic assumptions that could sink this idea about customers, about switching. So they ran multiple experiments. Once they felt they resolved that, they moved to the next assumption, which in this case was around picking and packing efficiently. In fact, one of the things they did using their existing resources was they stopped and they said, let's take receipts from the past week or so, and in the stores, we will take those receipts and we will see how quickly, efficiently, and cost-effectively we can pick and pack. So they ran that experiment the first time with a few people in the store, and it was slow and it was ineffective. So they adapted. They then had teams of people doing it. It was a little better, a little faster, but still inefficient. They were worried they were going to run at a deficit. They then began to come up with a shopping cart that allowed them to work in teams and to have 10, 15 orders done simultaneously. They ran serial experiments until they felt they were ready to be able to scale. The test, learn, adapt model The lean model was the approach they used. So when you get down to it, this is about juxtaposing the knower versus the learner mindset. And this is why it's relevant for us. We have a tendency to be knowers. Our expertise is a trapdoor that we fall through because we know so much that we end up going into the normal patterns, just like Lewis Borders did, just like the Webvan team did. The learner's way, it's about not launching full concepts. It's about testing killer assumptions. We don't design pilots to test the whole thing. We design minimum products to do quick and rapid testing of individual assumptions. Failure for the knower is detrimental. We don't know why it fails because we tested the whole thing. But when you test an individual assumption, it allows you to learn off of each individual one. And therefore, failure is embraced. It's a tool, it's a mechanism for you to be able to quickly and cheaply to learn. And last but not least, when we fail and we're a knower and we take that traditional approach, we avoid the past. We sweep it under the rug. But the learner builds learning loops in. Small bets, affordable losses. So with that in mind, Mark Twain, I think, really nailed it best with this famous quote. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. That's the knower's mindset, and that's what we're trying to combat, taking a learning approach. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. So what can we do about it? In the last handful of minutes that I have, I want to reflect on 5 things, 5 recommendations that I believe you can take back to your everyday, to your work, to your personal lives, to your businesses, to everything that you do that'll help you be a learner and bring it into your organizations. So first things first, start small, iterate fast, and often. Now, a lot of people talk about start small, scale fast. I don't believe in the scale fast. It's about iterating fast. Iteration is where it's at. That's what experimentation is all about. It's about fast iterations, building upon the shoulders of giants. Let me tell you a little bit about where this has been done really well. Vincent van Gogh. Like many of the great masters, he was an expert at iteration. Let me pull up one of his most famous pieces. Anybody know what this is? This is the beginning of one of his masterpieces. Yell it out if you think you know. The Potato Eaters, absolutely. Well done. The Potato Eaters is one of Van Gogh's masterpieces. He started this with a sketch in Holland when he was working as a minister with the coal miners, and he had this idea, and he did first an initial sketch, then he did a second sketch, then he did a study of what he wanted the people to look like, to capture the features. And then he mailed this off to his brother, Theo, who worked as an art dealer, and he said, what do you think? How can I improve this? What do you like about this? And he waited, it took time, and he got letters back, and he gave him feedback, and then he moved on to the next medium, which was charcoal. And he started to try to capture affect, look, feel. He got more feedback on it, and then he moved to the canvas. An oil painting. This really lands the point that iteration is not about starting with a giant canvas. It's about starting with a small scrap of paper. It's about getting the first vision and then getting feedback and iterating. It's all about iterating fast and often. Next bit, kill one assumption at a time. I alluded to this before, but it's about not testing the whole thing. It's about testing the key assumptions, the critical assumptions, the ones that will sink your idea. And you need to find those killer assumptions. One company that did a really great job of this was Uber. Going way back to 2010, when it was still Uber Taxi, what did they do? They had many different killer assumptions, regulatory considerations. Could they get into markets? Would people actually use their cars to pick people up and actually effectively serve as a de facto taxi? And another big one was, would consumers like you and I use their smartphone to order a car? They did not know. But rather than test all those assumptions, all which could be killer assumptions, they took one. The idea that people may or may not order a car using their smartphone. So they went out, They got 3 people, a couple of friends who were the early founders of Uber. They came to Lower Manhattan in Soho. They took 3 cars. They built a really cheap and scrappy prototype of an app. They pushed it out with some AdWords and a little awareness campaign, and over the course of about a week or 2, they themselves drove around Lower Manhattan getting pickup of their cars and their rides to get input on whether it was going to work. And they were able to quickly see whether or not people would download the app, and then secondly, once they downloaded the app, would they actually go to the lengths of ordering a car? And they found pretty quickly from their learnings that yes, people would. But more importantly, not just validating that this was not a killer assumption, but they were able to get quick learnings from people as they experimented with the experience of picking people up and finding about how they would use this app and this experience. This helped to quickly pivot the whole concept of Uber, and it shifted the business early on by doing these small tests rather than testing the whole thing. Now, I mentioned killer assumptions. You need to have a framework for killer assumptions. And I have a simple framework that I use all the time, that I've used while I was leading worldwide innovation, and that I use now when I work with other teams and other groups around identifying their killer assumptions. And it comes down to 3 simple questions. Number 1, what are all the assumptions that must hold true for this idea to work? Now, using WebVan as kind of the model here, there would be more than this, but this is kind of a starting point of all the things that potentially have to hold true for this idea to work. Now, the next thing is, not all of these are of equal priority, of equal importance. They're not all killer assumptions, and we have to treat them as such. So the next question is, which of these will have the greatest impact on our business or our concept? Or in other words, which ones are going to keep us up at night? Which of these will keep us up at night? And then once you have that, the last bit is to ask, which of these are most uncertain? What do we know the least about that we have to resolve, or else this could be a killer assumption? Philippe Petit would have many killer assumptions, and he would test, not all of them, but he would test the most important ones as he learned and went along. By using this framework, you can prioritize, put your resources in the right place, and test and learn efficiently. The penultimate, and of course, a learning objective. The penultimate one that I want to hit on is about inviting failure. Now, I mentioned before that we often will sweep failure under the rug. That's often what happens when things don't work in large organizations. But I recommend going beyond just embracing failure or tolerating failure. I think you need to invite failure. You need to find ways to bring it in to your business and find creative ways to find those killer assumptions in ways that you can fail. Let me tell you a little bit more about that. One area where I find failure is really probably the most tolerated in practice is in stand-up comedy. You stand in front of an audience, testing out material, trying new things out. When it doesn't land, you know immediately. Chris Rock has become a master of testing out his material. And how does he do it? He goes to a place called the Stress Factory. It's in New Brunswick, New Jersey. It's a comedy club. And he goes there and he invites failure. How does he do it? He will take a notepad. He'll have all of his jokes laid out, and he'll sit down in front of an audience, 40, 50 people, and he will tell joke after joke. And when it doesn't land, he'll ask, hey, why wasn't that funny? And he'll get instant feedback. He courts failure. He invites the audience to ridicule him. People have said this is a brutal experience to see this, but this is what makes him a great stand-up comedian, because he pivots and he adapts all of his material. So when he's on late night with Jimmy Fallon, or he's on a world tour, the material's been tested. It's been bulletproofed. It works, and it's all because he invites failure. He's not afraid to fail. In fact, he courts it. I recommend that we look to doing that as well, inviting failure. Last but not least, we need to have a process and a mindset for disciplined learning. If you were to take a learner's mindset, there's a simple little rubric that I strongly recommend using. And again, it's 3 simple questions. If you want to do disciplined learning, these are the 3 things after any workshop, any project, any type of work that you do that involves testing and learning is asking these questions. What worked well? Would we do it again? What didn't work well? What would we do different next time? And then lastly, what can you do differently? Or how would you build or improve on this? 3 simple questions, often overlooked, generally omitted. This is the method, the muscle that you build as a learner, because when you do this, it allows you to rapidly learn and improve and iterate. So these are the 5 things I recommend taking home, building in, institutionalizing. And I'll leave you with this last thought. Philippe Petit, yes, he's a risk taker, however you slice it and dice it, but he's a learner. Everything he does is around experimenting, finding those killer assumptions, and ultimately taking that first step out, because until you take that first step out there, you never know if it's going to work. So I recommend that you start now thinking about how to shift your mindset and your organizational mindset from the knower mindset to a learner mindset. It will make all the difference. And just remember, don't look down.